Good morning, everyone. My name's Dylan Greenwood.
I'm Harold Eustache.
And this is For the Record with Greenwood Law here on WTOB.
And this morning we have with us Dionne Jenkins. She is a local attorney. She is General Counsel at Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools. She's also a double Deke, a 2006 graduate of Wake Forest Law School. So we welcome Ms. Dionne.
It's our pleasure having you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And today we're going to be talking about virtual learning and all the issues around virtual learning and with Ms. Jenkins. So we wanted to start off with you and just with virtual learning, everybody understands why we have it because of COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're all in. But can you explain how that's affected you in Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools?
Sure. So when the pandemic got to a point where the state, in conjunction with the governor's office and state health officials and the state school board the state board of education, convened a group to try to just say, okay, how are schools going to reopen in the fall? And they developed some guidelines that school districts must follow in determining whether or not they're going to reopen. And a lot of that is driven by the governor's kind of executive orders. They've evolved over time. But, right now we're kind of in we're in the governor's phase 3, but when it comes to schools, we're in a plan B/A mode. And so school districts were charged with coming up with 3 possible plans depending upon how the metrics go, how the numbers rise or fall as far as number of positive cases. Plan A is somewhat business as usual with some social distancing and a few other restrictions in place. Plan B is a kind of a hybrid, reduced capacity, enhanced safety measures, those sorts of things. And then Plan C is 100% remote learning. And so in July, when the governor made his initial announcement that the state can reopen under a Plan B scenario, it gave flexibility to school districts to determine if they wanted to remain on remote learning or go to a Plan B model based on their own individual county metrics. And so our school board ultimately made the decision to start the year in a Plan C. And so ever since pretty much we closed schools in March, I've been working on what the reopening is going to look like for the school district. And
I'm sure you've been quite busy then.
I have been very busy, but it's good work. It's interesting work, but there's just a lot that goes into it, especially with the requirements, the safety requirements that school districts have to comply with. It puts strains on transportation, on capacity in the buildings, and that sort of thing. So since March, that's pretty much been my job, along with the job of the superintendent and other senior leaders in the school district. It's just trying to develop those plans for reopening school.
Needless to say, moving an entire school system onto a purely online synchronous format doesn't come without its issues. And some of the issues that we've seen around the nation have involved students that have been suspended or have possibly been handed some sort of legal action because of things that have been demonstrated or shown on an online Zoom call. And I'm sure you've been aware of those as well.
Yes.
One of those that has been of notoriety was a young boy out of Louisiana who had a BB gun that appeared on the Zoom call. There isn't really any evidence or anything to show that he was pointing it at anybody or handling it in a way that would, make someone feel threatened. But it was just there. And because of that, police were called and then actions by the school were taking place. And those brought about a lot of notoriety around the nation and a lot of scrutiny because of what occurred. And it was just really something that piqued our interest because, we deal with cases with weapons on educational property, which is something to absolutely take very serious. I myself, I was at Virginia Tech in 2009. That was something that I lived with. I was there on campus. At the same time, though, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect with something that happens on a Zoom call versus something that happens actually physically on campus. And we were wondering, what things that you guys have seen here in Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools. Obviously, we haven't heard anything like that come out in the news, but there's got to have been some sort of issues that have occurred.
Right. So you're right. With the virtual learning scenario, there are opportunities, but there also are many challenges. And the scenario that you described is definitely one of those challenges because we have a different window to children's homes and rooms than we otherwise had, just them being physically on campus. And so I'm definitely familiar with that scenario there. I don't know all the facts of the situation, and I don't necessarily know from what standpoint they chose to get law enforcement involved. Mm-hmm. I will say in a traditional setting, when kids are at school, if they have a BB gun or something like that on campus, the law requires that to be notified, to report it to law enforcement.
Yeah.
It's treated as a weapon, and those types of imitation guns or lookalike guns are treated in the same manner if they were in a school facility. If someone's at their home, it's a little bit different. But I do think, though, that there can be either a misunderstanding or misconception that something that happens off campus can't have repercussions in a school environment.
Okay.
And sometimes it can. It just really depends on the way that the law has interpreted it over the years, is what level of disruption it can cause to the school environment, or whether or not there's a direct or immediate impact to the school environment from that off-campus activity.
So is it fair to say then that if a student was to receive some sort of disciplinary repercussion from a school, it would mostly be derived from that student disrupting the online classroom environment?
Yes. In my opinion, that's what it should be based on, is level of disruption, or is that student making a threat, or are they posing a threat in any way to that student, or are they somehow displaying some content that either violates their policies in a normal setting, or something that's vulgar or obscene or objectively unreasonable.
So what would be if a student, for example, was wearing a shirt that had some foul language on it, some obscene language or something, and they're on a Zoom call, is that something that would potentially be something that would disrupt that classroom environment?
Yes, potentially. You look at the Zoom classroom setting as somewhat of an extension of the physical school classroom. So a student in a normal time, non-pandemic time, would not be able to come to school with a shirt with a bunch of profanity on it.
They'd be sent home.
Right. That would definitely cause a problem. So in this scenario, if a student is in a Zoom setting, they're visible to the entire class, and they're wearing a shirt or something that's displaying a bunch of profane words that could potentially have consequences, likely would cause some sort of disruption to the classroom. And also just because generally, profane language like that is prohibited by our school policies.
Right. Regarding the weapons issue that occurred, that actually can have far-reaching legal consequences in the criminal justice system too, can it? And I think you're familiar with that. And Harold, you've been a prosecutor here in the state of North Carolina, and now you're a defense attorney, keenly aware of that as well. What are the repercussions in a criminal justice setting that a student might receive for a weapon on educational property?
So they could be charged with misdemeanor for possessing it on educational property and possessing any sort of weapon. And typically, a lot of times, these searches or weapons are found through either teachers or administrators or SROs. School resource officers, and of course with virtual learning the school resource officers aren't there, but in the criminal justice system there's a large connection between school resource officers and prosecutors working together. Part of it too is that with weapons on educational property there's a different standard for searches around schools, and so a lot of times these weapons are found in book bags or lockers, and courts have determined that school environment doesn't have the same sort of Fourth Amendment standard in order to search a locker or book bag, and you can find these sorts of things there. And so because of those relaxed Fourth Amendment standards, I'd wonder, how does that even apply to a virtual sense. So what if a student is just possessing that firearm on camera? Would just the possession of it, would that have any implications, you think, for that student?
So if a student is actually possessing an actual firearm, so not an imitation or BB gun, then I think there definitely are some implications there. But not only from the standpoint of our policies. It's not on school property, so it's probably looked at a little bit differently. But it's still possession of a firearm by a minor. And there also could potentially be some abuse, neglect, abuse or neglect or contributing to delinquency of a juvenile issues. And that
would implicate the parents.
And that would implicate the parents. So, there are certain offenses that, if they occur on school property, are required to be reported to law enforcement. That doesn't mean in a situation like that it couldn't also be reported, because it poses a threat to the safety of that child. If the child is possessing a firearm, that certainly is a health or safety concern, I would say, for a teacher.
If you're just joining us here on WTOB, still in Greenwood, Harold Eustache and Dionne Jenkins here from Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools. She's a school systems attorney. We appreciate her being on the show with us today, and we've been talking about issues with Zoom calls and disciplinary issues and stuff related to online learning that we're having to deal with in the midst of a pandemic. And of course, it hasn't been a smooth ride by any means, but we're handling it the best we can. And like I said, we appreciate Ms. Jenkins being on the radio with us today. One of the things that is an issue with online learning in general is access to education. Now, Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools, and you've got two boys in Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools, so you know firsthand. Has done a great job of giving everyone access to Chromebooks that can get online, access their online lessons, and make it there. That's about as much probably as anybody can do, but then it's up to the student, the parent, to be able to then access that online learning environment. And you can't help but think that not every situation is perfect, and there are going to be some issues with access to these educational opportunities. When it comes to discipline, and something occurs in a class that's disruptive and how it might affect the overall classroom environment, it seems like if the go-to, like for instance in this Louisiana case, is to suspend this young man, and all of a sudden he's not in class anymore. So you've got a situation where it's taking away from an already compromised classroom environment or educational opportunity. It seems to me like suspensions should be an opportunity. It really should be a last resort when it gets down to it. Do you mind commenting on that a little bit?
Sure. I think the question that you pose is an issue that school districts across the state are trying to grapple with. Is how do you balance the need to maintain order and discipline in the classroom, but then also not create additional challenges or further decrease access for some students to their curriculum and to their educational materials. And I think honestly, suspension in this environment that we're in, where students are going to be engaging in remote learning for a large majority of the time, should probably be a last resort, with the exception of the very egregious types of offenses. We certainly don't want to create more challenges for students, and so I think administrators across the state are looking at other creative ways to address behavior so that the students aren't removed from the educational environment. So for example, instead of just outright cutting the students' access off for however many days, maybe having them check in with an ISS teacher, or give them some work that they can work on asynchronously, as opposed to being in the Zoom classroom if it's something that caused a major disruption. So those are just examples of other creative ways to address discipline while not creating more challenges for the child at home.
And that's a relief to hear. And earlier you talked about and mentioned that there are potential issues off campus, legal issues off campus, that could have repercussions to a child in the school system, to where they could either be suspended or removed from the school entirely. Do you mind giving us some examples of those? Because I'm not sure everybody out there necessarily even knows that can have that impact.
Right. So as I mentioned before, for off-campus conduct to be able to be dealt with in a school setting, there needs to be some direct and immediate impact on the school environment or some sort of substantial disruption to the school environment. And so for serious offenses such as threatening other students with a weapon, engaging in violent conduct off campus, the offenses like murder, serious assaults inflicting serious injury, armed robbery, those more violent offenses tend to have the harsher consequences in the school setting and can subject a student to, suspension or expulsion in extreme circumstances.
Okay. One of the other issues, too, is compulsory attendance. And traditionally, attendance is very important, obviously, and it still is, but parents can be held accountable and even charged criminally for a student's attendance. So can you explain whether the compulsory attendance laws have changed at all with virtual learning, and if they have or haven't, how that affects virtual learning and parents?
So the law itself has not changed. I think the way people are implementing the law and school systems are evaluating how they're going to address attendance has changed because of the world that we live in now. And there are many, like you mentioned, there are many challenges to students accessing online instruction. But the Department of Public Instruction for North Carolina has issued some guidance on how you count a student present and how you mark attendance. And so it's not just based on whether or not a student logged on that day because of those challenges, but it's based on their participation in the class, whether or not they're turning in their assignments, have they made efforts to reach out to the teacher, all those things considered can be used to mark students present and to continue to monitor their attendance. Not to say that there won't be some students out there that don't do any of that, but I think that it used to be, under compulsory attendance laws as it is, at 3 days, 6 days, and 10 days, there's a notification that goes to the parent that says, pursuant to the truancy laws, you could be prosecuted, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can't necessarily treat it the same this year just because the attendance world just looks different.
So would this year, would parents still be charged in the same way they used to be if their student isn't signing on as much, or would that happen?
Well, it's hard to say will it happen. I can't say it absolutely won't, but I do think that there are increased efforts to try to prevent that from happening this year. Okay. So if we monitor student activity on the online platforms, and so if we start to see that there are students at particular schools that aren't logging on or appear to have issues accessing the education, there are a number of resources that we will provide the family before we ever get to that point. Okay. And so, for example, we will refer students to what we call the CARES teams. Every school has a CARES team, and they can go out into the community. They can try to make contact with the family to see if what barriers exist to the child accessing their curriculum. We have remote learning centers that are set up at various organizations in the community that children, if for some reason they're having trouble, they can go there, they can get tutoring assistance. There's someone from the school that can check in, help them log on, etc. So there's a number of steps to take before we ultimately get to that point.
That's great work. I mean, that level of access, I wasn't even fully aware of. So that's great work by Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools to be able to do that, to try to get all of its students online and be able to learn and really not skip a beat as much as possible. Because when it gets down to it, if there are truancy issues, that comes back on the parent. Both parents, because they're both responsible for getting the child there, and it's a Class 1 misdemeanor.
It is, and it's a serious misdemeanor in which, when I was an assistant district attorney here, I run the truancy court quite a bit, and I think you and I had lots of interaction on that, and it is something that parents have to take seriously because it can be serious, in the sense that you can face jail time for it.
Right, and we certainly don't want to add to the challenges that parents are already facing right now. I think we're all just kind of saying, how can we work together to help children continue to advance this year as much as possible? Nobody wanted this situation for education, and we're all just trying to manage it and help students as much as possible not fall behind and progress forward.
Right. If you're just joining us, this is For the Record with Greenwood Law. I'm Harold Eustache, and Dylan Greenwood is here as well. We have Dionne Jenkins with us from Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools. And we've been talking about all the issues surrounding virtual learning and discipline and truancy as well. Another issue that we've read about that's come up recently is with FERPA. And can you explain what FERPA is and how that could relate to virtual learning?
Sure. So FERPA stands for the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And it's this huge body of federal legislation, and it applies to any educational institution that receives federal funding. So basically all public schools, and even some private schools if they receive federal funding for one reason or another. And under FERPA, there are some basic rights that are afforded to parents, and they call them eligible students, which are students that are 18 years of age or older. Once a student turns 18, whatever FERPA rights under that exist transfer from the parent to the child because they're a legal adult. So they have the right to confidentiality of student education records. Parents have the right to request copies of their child's records. They have the right to file a complaint if they feel like their child's records have been disclosed without their permission, when permission was required, and so forth and so on. So school districts are governed by FERPA, and there are exceptions to types of records that don't fall under FERPA, but kind of the basic premise is that a school district cannot disclose education records about a student or personally identifiable information about a student without the consent of the parent. That's kind of the basic premise of FERPA.
So would some of what's happened nationally is the issue around recording some of these Zoom calls, and there could be some educational purpose for a teacher recording either themselves, but what about if the students themselves are being recorded? How is that taken into account? And would that be an issue with FERPA?
So not necessarily. It really depends on what's included on the recording. And so in the virtual world that we live in, teachers often have to record their lessons because they need to make them available for students who weren't on the class, or they need to make them available for another cohort of students or something like that. And so as long as the platform that's being used to record students, such as Zoom for education or Microsoft Teams, is considered a school official with a legitimate education interest under FERPA, then it's okay for those recordings to be made. Parent consent's not required in general. However, if something comes out on the recording, let's say a student is engaging in some misbehavior for which they are later recommended for discipline, and that's captured on the recording, well then either the recording or that portion thereof that depicts that behavior now is a confidential education record for that student. So that portion could not be shared with anyone else without the written consent of that parent. It would have to be redacted from the recording before it's posted and made available for anyone else to view. So if there's educational information or personally identifiable information that's captured on the recording, then there may be some additional protections under FERPA that has to be afforded to that recording.
That's good to know, because we were reading the disclaimers for Zoom as it relates to K through 12 education. They try to do their best to make sure that they were fully insulated with what they were providing, which is understandable, but it's good to know that how FERPA may or may not apply in these particular circumstances. But thank you for shedding light on that.
Absolutely.
So, Ms. Jenkins, considering all these issues that we have talked about today with Zoom calls and how Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools is handling them rather adeptly, I must say. I mean, we've learned a lot just from talking to you about everything that you guys have been doing and what you've implemented. What's the outlook going forward with online learning in Winston-Salem Forsyth County Schools?
Sure. So actually recently our board voted to move to Plan B. We were on Plan C for the first quarter, but we're moving to Plan B over the next few weeks. And so right now teachers are getting ready. They're back in the buildings, and a lot of them are coming back on Monday and just getting their classes ready. In a few weeks later this month, our pre-K kiddos and then some students in some of our special education classes are going to start transitioning back into the building. Elementary school students are going to be in the building the most, and then middle school will gradually phase in after that. And as of now, high school is scheduled to come back at the end of first semester. Everything's subject to change because it's based on the metrics,
of course,
right? The numbers could go up or down, and so we're going to continue to monitor that. But right now, children that are scheduled to come back over the next few weeks, they're phasing in. They're going to be divided into either 2 or 4 cohorts based on the size of their school. We will give parents the option to continue to remain on remote learning if they want to, either via our virtual academy, or we have set up situations where they can still get their classroom teacher and their school experience in a remote environment. So that's exciting to be able to offer that as well for parents that want that flexibility. But we're excited to start getting back in school mode. But like I said, things can always change, and parents should just keep out for those calls that I'm sure everybody is tired of getting right now, and then continue to monitor the Our Safe Return page on our school district website for any changes in the projected schedules.
Well, I'm sure parents will be happy to hear about all of that coming up. Might take some of the stress off at least, given everything that's happened here in 2020. But Ms. Jenkins, we can't thank you enough for coming on with us today. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And don't forget to join us next Sunday with For the Record with Greenwood Law. We are going to be talking about the difference between CBD and hemp and marijuana. It's something that Dylan and I deal with all the time. In our practice. And so we're going to be discussing all the issues around that and searches. And so we hope you join us next Sunday.
Yeah, is smell alone enough?
I don't know. You got to watch and find out. So before we go, though, don't forget the Greenwood Law Bill of Rights. 1, I will not represent myself in a court of law. I will not do law enforcement's job for them. I will not make statements when stopped by law enforcement. I will not consent to searches when asked by law enforcement, and I will not be my own star witness for the prosecution. Remember, everyone, that it's not a crime to assert your rights. Stay informed, stay safe. This is For the Record with Greenwood Law.